I asked an advanced AI system to dig through everything humans have ever recorded about who built the pyramids. Every excavation report, every papyrus, every bone fragment ever pulled out of the sand at Giza. I told it one thing: forget the documentaries, forget the conspiracy videos. Just give me the evidence. What came back was not aliens. It was not Atlantis. It was not a lost advanced civilization erased from history. What came back was something stranger than all of that, because it was real, and because almost nobody actually knows it. For over 100 years, two stories have fought for control of the pyramids. The first story says slaves built them: whips, chains, tens of thousands of men dying under the desert sun for a pharaoh's ego. This is the Hollywood version. It's in the movies. It's in the cartoons. It's the image burned into most people's heads the moment they hear the word pyramid. The second story says humans could never have done this alone. Too precise, too heavy, too perfect. So the story goes to aliens, or Atlanteans, or some vanished super civilization that taught the Egyptians everything and then disappeared without a trace. Both stories are wrong. And the real answer is far more unsettling, because it means every one of us is capable of something we've been told only gods or aliens could pull off. Let's start with the weight of the problem, literally. The Great Pyramid of Giza is built from an estimated 2.3 million blocks of stone. The average block weighs about 2.5 tons. Some of the granite blocks inside the king's chamber weigh as much as 80 tons, hauled from a quarry at Aswan, roughly 800 kilometers away. The entire structure originally stood at 146 meters tall, making it the tallest man-made structure on Earth for almost 4,000 years. Nothing built by humans surpassed it in height until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in the 1200s. I'll let that sit for a second. A civilization with no iron tools, no wheels for heavy hauling, no pulleys in the form we use today, built something that stayed the tallest object made by human hands for nearly 4 millennia. So the question isn't unreasonable. How does a Bronze Age society, without cranes, without engines, without modern mathematics as we know it, move stones that heavy, that far, and stack them that high, that precisely, for decades? This question had no satisfying answer, and that gap is exactly where the alien theories crawled in. When there's a mystery and no clear explanation, people fill it with the most dramatic story available. But archaeology doesn't stay quiet forever. Over the last 30 years, the ground itself has started answering back. In 1990, something happened at Giza that quietly demolished the slave theory forever. A tourist's horse stumbled into a mud brick wall buried in the sand south of the pyramids. That accident led archaeologists Zahi Hawass and Mark Lenner to a site that changed everything we thought we knew. Underneath the sand was an entire town, not a prison camp. A town with streets, housing blocks, bakeries, breweries, and food processing facilities large enough to feed thousands of people a day. Inside that town, archaeologists found evidence of an industrial scale food operation. Bakeries capable of producing bread in bulk, breweries producing beer, not as a luxury, but as a daily wage. Records and residue analysis suggest workers were receiving something like 4 to 5 liters of beer a day as part of their payment, alongside bread, meat, and grain. Nobody pays slaves a beer ration. You pay a workforce a beer ration. This wasn't punishment, this was payroll. Then came the bones. Skeletal remains recovered from a cemetery near the workers' town told a story that should be more famous than it is. Researchers found skeletons with healed fractures, broken arms and legs that had been set and allowed to mend, meaning someone treated these injuries and let the person recover, rather than discarding them. There is evidence of amputations that healed, meaning survivable medical intervention existed for laborers. There's also evidence of basic orthopedic care, of workers being buried with dignity in tombs near the pyramid. Complex itself, an incredible honor if these were disposable enslaved people rather than valued members of a labor force. You don't get elaborate burial rites so close to a royal monument if you're a slave the state considers replaceable. The food numbers alone are staggering. Based on animal bone deposits and papyri records found near the workers' town and at the Wadi al-Jarf harbor site, researchers estimate the operation consumed something on the scale of 21 cattle and 23 sheep or goats every single day just to feed the workforce. That's not a rough guess pulled from nowhere. That's calculated from actual butchery waste and bone deposits recovered from the site. To sustain that kind of meat consumption day after day for years, you need an entire supply chain. Ranchers, herders, transporters, butchers, bakers, brewers, all coordinated by a central authority. That is not a chaotic mass of chained prisoners. That is a functioning, planned, logistics-driven economy built specifically to construct one building. Now here's where it gets even more specific, because in 2013, archaeologists found something that reads like a diary written by a ghost. In caves near the Red Sea coast at Wadi al-Jarf, a team led by Pierre Tallet uncovered the oldest known inscribed papyri in the world, dating back roughly 4,500 years to the reign of Pharaoh Khufu himself, the pharaoh the Great Pyramid was built for. Among these, papyri was the logbook of a man named Merer, an official, who oversaw a crew of about 40 workers. Merer's diary describes, in his own handwriting, day-by-day entries of hauling limestone blocks by boat along the Nile in a specially built canal system, from the Tura quarry to the Giza construction site. He records how many days it took, how the canal locks were used to manage water flow, and how the crews rotated their labor. This is a first-hand, contemporary account of pyramid construction, written by someone who was actually there, managing actual workers, and it describes an organized transport operation, not a whip-driven death march. And the water transport detail matters more than most people realize, because for years, one of the biggest mysteries was how the ancient Egyptians moved stone so efficiently across the desert without modern roads. The answer, it turns out, might not have been the desert at all. In 2024, a team of researchers published findings identifying the traces of a long-lost branch of the Nile River, now buried under desert and farmland, that once ran much closer to the pyramid fields than the current riverbed does. This ancient waterway, now called the Ahrimat Branch, would have flowed directly past more than 30 pyramids, including Giza during the Old Kingdom period. If this branch was active during construction, it solves a massive logistical puzzle. Instead of dragging multi-ton blocks for miles across sand, workers could have floated them most of the way by river barge, then hauled them only the final short stretch to the build site. The river did the heavy lifting, the humans did the finishing work. This lines up with something else discovered decades earlier and largely ignored by pop culture: the boat pits at Giza. In 1954, a fully intact cedarwood ship, over 43 meters long, was discovered dismantled and buried in a pit right next to the Great Pyramid. It's known as the Khufu ship. It wasn't a myth or a decoration. It was a real, functional vessel, precise enough that when reassembled it can actually float. This proves the ancient Egyptians had serious naval engineering capability at the exact time the pyramids were being built, capability sophisticated enough to move massive cargo by water across long distances. None of this engineering knowledge arrived fully formed either, and one of the most honest human pieces of evidence for that sits about 40 kilometers south of Giza, at a site called Dashur. There, the pharaoh Sneferu, Khufu's own father, attempted to build what should have been a smooth-sided pyramid, only for his engineers to run into a genuine structural crisis partway through construction. Cracks began appearing in the internal chambers as the weight of the upper structure bore down at the original steep angle, and rather than let the whole thing collapse, the builders made a visible permanent correction, dropping the angle of the upper section from around 54 degrees to a much shallower 43, giving the finished monument an unmistakable kink partway up its sides. Today it's known simply as the Bent Pyramid, and it stands as the closest thing Egyptology has to a signed confession of trial and error, a mid-project engineering fix, caught permanently in stone from the same generation of builders who would go on to perfect the design at Giza just years later. That's not the record of a civilization that received perfect knowledge from an outside intelligence. That's the record of engineers learning from a near disaster in real time and adjusting, which is a far more human and far more impressive story. So we have a workforce that was paid, fed, medically treated, and organized. We have a river system that solved the transport problem. But that still leaves the single biggest question that keeps people awake at 3 a.m. scrolling through documentaries. How did they lift and place stones weighing 2.5 tons, some up to 80 tons, with such extreme precision, using nothing but manpower and simple tools? It's worth pausing on just how rare that kind of precision still is, even now. Modern surveyors have pointed out that a fair number of contemporary large-scale construction projects built with laser levels, GPS, and satellite positioning still fail to match the base leveling accuracy the Great Pyramid achieved with ropes, water, and stars. A genuinely humbling comparison for an industry with every technological advantage imaginable. Let's talk about that precision first, because the numbers here are genuinely hard to believe. The base of the Great Pyramid covers about 13 acres, and it is level to within just 2 centimeters across that entire footprint. 2 centimeters across 13 acres, without lasers, without GPS, without modern surveying equipment. The 4 sides of the pyramid are aligned to true north with an accuracy of within 1/10 of a degree, more accurate than some modern buildings constructed with contemporary tools. Some researchers believe the ancient Egyptians used the stars, specifically circumpolar stars that never dip below the horizon, to calibrate true north with startling accuracy, essentially using astronomy as their surveying instrument. Others point to careful use of water-filled trenches to establish a perfectly level baseline, since water always finds a flat plane no matter what. Either way, the precision on display isn't magic. It's obsessive, patient, mathematically literate engineering carried out by people who understood geometry at a level we tend to underestimate. Now, to the lifting problem itself. For years, the dominant theory was simple. Massive straight ramps built from mud brick and rubble, dragging blocks up on sledges. The issue is that a straight ramp tall and long enough to reach the top of a 146-meter pyramid would require more material than the pyramid itself, which doesn't add up practically or economically. This is where French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed something different in the early 2000s, an internal spiral ramp theory, suggesting the Egyptians built the pyramid with an internal corkscrew-shaped ramp running up through the inside of the structure itself, used to haul the upper stones into place, then partially left inside the finished monument. Scans using a technique called muon tomography, which uses cosmic ray particles to see through solid stone the way an X-ray sees through skin, have actually detected unexplained voids and structures inside the Great Pyramid that some researchers believe could support this theory. It's also worth knowing what the Great Pyramid actually looked like when it was finished, because the structure tourists photographed today is, in a very real sense, the skeleton of the original building. The entire exterior was once covered in a smooth casing of brilliant white Tora limestone, quarried from the eastern bank of the Nile and polished so precisely that the seams between blocks were reportedly finer than a razor blade, tight enough that a piece of paper couldn't slide into the joint. When sunlight hit that polished white surface, ancient accounts describe the pyramid appearing to glow, and it may originally have been capped with a pyramidion, a small pointed capstone plated in electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that would have caught the sunrise and sunset from miles away across the desert. Almost none of that casing survives today. In the year 1303, a massive earthquake struck the region and loosened huge sections of that polished limestone shell. And over the following century, the rulers of medieval Cairo systematically stripped what remained to build mosques, bridges, and fortifications across the growing city, including sections of the walls around Cairo's citadel. A handful of original casing stones still cling to the base of the Great Pyramid today, and a more substantial cap of the original polished limestone survives near the summit of the neighboring pyramid of Khafra, giving modern visitors the only real glimpse left of what these monuments were actually built to look like, gleaming white and gold rather than the weathered tan-stepped ruin most people picture. The sheer pace required to actually finish the Great Pyramid within a couple of decades is a genuinely staggering statistic on its own, and it's one more reason the organized workforce theory holds up so well under scrutiny. If the roughly 2.3 million blocks were placed over a 20-year construction window, running crews working 10-hour days, the math works out to a new block being quarried, hauled, and set into position somewhere on the site every few minutes, hour after hour, for 2 straight decades, without modern machinery of any kind. That kind of sustained industrial tempo doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen through improvisation. It requires a planning apparatus capable of scheduling quarry crews, river transport convoys, ramp laborers, and stone-setting teams so that none of them are ever idle and none of them are ever bottlenecked waiting on each other, a level of large-scale project management that modern construction planners still study with genuine respect. Which brings us to one of the most genuinely shocking discoveries of the last decade, one your average person has probably never heard of. In 2017, an international team called the Scan Pyramids Project used muon detectors, essentially catching high-energy particles that constantly rain down from space and pass through solid rock, to map the interior of the Great Pyramid without drilling a single hole. What they found stunned the archaeological world. A massive hidden void, at least 30 meters long, sitting above the Grand Gallery, a space big enough to fit a full-sized passenger airplane inside it. Nobody knew this existed. Not tour guides, not Egyptologists, not the thousands of tourists who've walked through those corridors for centuries. A hollow space the size of a jetliner, sitting silently inside one of the most studied buildings on the planet, undetected until particles falling from outer space revealed it. As of now, its exact purpose is still unknown. It could be a construction technique remnant, part of an internal ramp system, or something else entirely, and that mystery is still actively being investigated today. The Scan Pyramids team didn't stop there either. In 2023, using the same muon imaging technique combined with a tiny endoscope camera threaded through a small existing gap, researchers confirmed a second previously unknown space, a 9-meter corridor sitting directly behind the chevron-shaped blocks visible above the pyramid's original main entrance. Egyptologists believe this corridor most likely exists to redistribute the enormous weight of the stone above the entrance itself, protecting the passageway beneath it from collapsing under its own mass, essentially an engineered relief. Structure the original builders designed and then sealed away, invisible for 4,500 years until cosmic ray physics caught up with their blueprint. 2 hidden internal spaces, found using 2 different applications of the exact same particle physics technique, within 6 years of each other, inside a structure people have been climbing over, mapping, and photographing for 2 centuries. If there were ever a building that still had secrets left to give up using nothing but patience and modern instruments, This is it, and there's no reason to think Scan Pyramids is finished looking. The skeletons from the workers' cemetery have even more to say beyond the healed fractures either, and what they reveal lines up perfectly with hard physical labor rather than anything mysterious. Bioarchaeological studies of the remains show widespread signs of arthritis in the spine and knees, exactly the kind of wear and tear you'd expect from years of hauling, lifting, and climbing, along with evidence of schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection common among people who spent long hours waiting in irrigation canals in the Nile itself. Precisely the environment river-based stone transport would have required. These aren't the skeletons of an elite or a spared class. They're the skeletons of manual laborers who did genuinely brutal physical work for years and were, by the standards of their own time, cared for and buried with dignity afterward regardless. Modern experimental archaeology backs up just how physically demanding, but achievable this work actually was too. In the 1990s, Egyptologist Mark Lenner and a team of quarry workers built a scaled-down pyramid using nothing but replica copper and stone tools, wooden sledges, and rope, deliberately avoiding any modern machinery, specifically to test whether Bronze Age technology was actually sufficient for the task. It was slow, it was exhausting, and it worked, proving in physical, repeatable, hands-on terms that every individual step of pyramid construction, quarrying, hauling, and setting stone was fully achievable with tools the Egyptians are known to have possessed, no outside help required. Back to how the blocks physically moved across sand, because there's an experiment that answers this almost embarrassingly well. In 2014, physicists from the University of Amsterdam ran a controlled experiment testing an old idea, that ancient Egyptian wall paintings depicting workers pouring water in front of sledges weren't ceremonial, they were literally showing the technique. The physicists built small-scale sledges and dragged them across dry sand, then wet sand. Dry sand builds up in a mound in front of the sledge, creating resistance that makes hauling brutally hard. But wet sand, with just the right amount of moisture, creates capillary bridges between grains that stiffen the surface and dramatically reduce friction, cutting the pulling force required by roughly half. There is an actual ancient Egyptian tomb painting from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, showing a large stone statue being dragged on a sledge, with a single worker standing at the front pouring water directly onto the sand ahead of it. For decades, people saw that painting and assumed it was purely symbolic or ritual. Physics proved it was a literal, functional instruction manual. So piece by piece, the picture assembles itself. A river system, possibly running much closer to the construction site than the current Nile, used to transport stone with minimal manpower. A permanent, paid, fed, and medically cared for workforce living in a purpose-built town. A logistics operation, moving tens of thousands of loaves of bread, gallons of beer, and dozens of livestock daily to sustain them. Water poured onto sand to cut friction during hauling. Internal or external ramps, potentially spiral-shaped, used to raise blocks incrementally. Star-based and water-based surveying techniques to achieve leveling accuracy, modern engineers still find remarkable. And a hidden internal void, only recently discovered using technology involving literal cosmic radiation, sitting silently in the middle of it all, still not fully explained. Now, how many people actually did this work? The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, claimed it took 100,000 men laboring for 20 years. For centuries, that number stuck in the public imagination. But modern archaeological estimates, based on the actual size of the workers' town, its housing capacity, and its food production scale, suggest the real number was closer to 20,000 to 40,000 workers, and the construction likely took around 20 years for the Great Pyramid itself. Crucially, evidence suggests labor was organized in rotating shifts, tied to the agricultural calendar. During the months when the Nile flooded and farmland was underwater, farmers had nothing to farm, and it's widely believed this is when much of the pyramid workforce was drawn from the general population, essentially converting seasonal agricultural downtime into a national construction project. This wasn't slavery. This was closer to a nationwide public works program, possibly even something citizens took pride in contributing to, similar to how modern societies rally around massive infrastructure or wartime production efforts. There's more evidence for this national pride angle, too. Deep inside the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, chambers built specifically to distribute the weight of the stone above so the ceiling wouldn't collapse, workers left graffiti, actual handwritten marks in red ochre paint naming their work gangs. Names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure have been found scrawled onto blocks that no tourist, no pharaoh, and often no other worker would ever see again once the pyramid was sealed. These weren't official inscriptions meant for eternity or religious purpose. These were essentially ancient graffiti, workers tagging their crew names the way construction workers today might scrawl initials on a beam nobody will ever see again. That single detail humanizes the entire project more than almost anything else. Real people, working in named teams, leaving their mark in places designed never to be seen, purely because they were proud enough of the work to sign it. So when you put the alien theory, the lost civilization theory, and the slave theory next to what the actual dirt, bones, papyri, and cosmic ray scans tell us, none of them hold up. What actually built the Great Pyramid was a highly organized, well-fed, medically supported, seasonally rotated Egyptian workforce using river transport, water, lubricated sand, star-based surveying, and possibly internal ramp systems, all coordinated by a centralized state with the administrative capacity to plan and execute a multi-decade infrastructure project on a scale that arguably wasn't matched again for thousands of years. That's the answer. Not aliens, not a vanished super-civilization. Just ordinary humans, tens of thousands of them, organized with a level of precision, logistics, and long-term planning that honestly makes the alien theory feel almost insulting to what they actually accomplished. Because think about what that really means. No engines, no modern surveying tools, no cranes, no trucks, and they still built something so precise that engineers with laser levels today look at its base and shake their heads. Still built something so massive it held the tallest building record for 38 centuries, and still hid a void inside it the size of an airplane that we only found by catching particles falling from outer space. We didn't need aliens to explain the pyramids. We needed the right questions, the right excavation sites, and the patience to actually listen to what the sand had been protecting for 4,500 years. The workers' town buried under a stumbling horse. A diary written by a supervisor named Merer, sealed in a cave for 4.5 millennia. A river that vanished from the map, but never fully vanished from the ground. Graffiti scrawled by men proud of a job nobody would ever thank them for, by name. The pyramids were never a mystery that needed extraterrestrials to solve. They were a mirror. They showed exactly what humans are capable of when an entire society commits itself to one impossible goal for 20 straight years. And maybe that's the actual shocking twist nobody saw coming when I asked an AI to dig into the evidence. The truth wasn't stranger than fiction because of who built the pyramids. It was stranger than fiction because of how ordinary the builders actually were, and how extraordinary ordinary people turned out to be. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually buried in the historical record is something you want more of, there's a lot more where this came from, because honestly, the real history is always stranger than the myths built on top of it.